Great. My name is Mark Munger. I've been a management consultant, and in this engagement, I was working with Valaicon Management Consulting, which asked us to work on a problem with Johnson & Johnson in Europe, EMEA, where there was a chronic and increasing problem of very high potential younger women leaving EMEA, women in whom the organization had invested a great deal of time and money and effort and training, regarding as high potential and regarding as really the future of J&J in Europe. J&J has a long and proud history of applying ethical criteria to its work. It has a credo that's on the walls in the history in New Brunswick about the way it treats people. And many people in Johnson & Johnson were quite distressed that these young women were leaving. Many of the senior people, from very senior women in New Jersey to very senior women in Europe, but their distress was shared by their male counterparts. And so they asked us to help them understand what was going on and possibly to suggest a solution. And we had the liberty of working with very competent colleagues internally in J&J, and we proposed a different way of looking at it. Instead of wondering why the women were leaving, could we try to ascertain why the women might be staying? And what is it that the women who were staying, what did they do differently from the women who left? Which began a series of many interviews ranging from the Scandinavian countries all the way to Greece and into North Africa, in which we tried to ask questions that would assist these women in making a diagnosis about what enabled them to commit themselves to J&J when many of their peers were leaving. And the self-reports, and actually backed up by considerable data, by their supervisors' performance reviews and by other things, is the women who stayed had a perhaps different mindset than the women who were leaving. One, they felt that they could make their own way in the corporation as it existed because they did a couple of things differently. One is that they made aggressive efforts to network with other women, not just to talk about gender-specific issues, but to talk about overall performance issues and solve problems that they faced in common with the business in Europe. They also made an effort to form professional relationships with their male peers to help them solve problems, and also with their male supervisors. And one particular nuance is that they asked for help. And they didn't ask for help in a way that made them seem weak or ill-equipped, but they asked for strong help and developed, if you will, psychological contracts with the men with whom they worked. And they were fairly tough-minded negotiators. They said, look, in effect, if you expect me to be successful, these are the resources that I need, and this is the kind of support system I want, and this is the kind of influence I expect to have. Why am I not at that table? I should be at that table. But they were quite diplomatically skilled in their way to do that, and they sometimes compared notes with their more senior female and male counterparts to do that. One of the things that emerged from this was a thought that a couple of preliminary efforts to have women come together had been quite successful. And so there was an intention made to create a program for women to join and share their perspectives. There was a little bit of doubt about whether programs work in terms of organizational and cultural change, but they decided to experiment. And they searched for help throughout leading European business schools as a venue to explore some of the professional development issues these women had. And they finally decided that it was insufficient. Even some of the most prestigious European schools seemed either disinterested or what they offered was insufficient. So they went to the University of Cape Town in South Africa and began a week's program, which they later expanded with J&J operations in other countries. But they figured that South Africans had made a real effort to deal with diversity and issues of diversity, and they might learn there. So they brought a problem-centered approach. They learned a little bit from their South African counterparts, but they also brought real-life case studies which they began to work on in groups and come up with non-traditional solutions, not just to helping women stay retained in J&J, but progress, to make progress. This led to an invitation to the bosses, to the supervisors of the women who were invited. And they said, you're a team really, and you need to come work and learn to do some team building. And some of the men were reluctant to go, but they decided this might be a very interesting innovation because some of the men were flummoxed how they helped women, and they thought that they could go and learn perhaps to be more adept or more facile in helping the women who reported to them. So subordinate and supervisor went to South Africa. They had very engaging encounters there with their peers and solved some problems. One of the suggestions that came out of the South African experience was that men might be evaluated on how sufficiently they help to mentor women who work for them. There are some men who are quite good at being mentors, and there are other men who did not take it seriously or lack the skills to do it. And they decided that this might even float up to a policy level where part of the men's performance review might be the track record of the women who had worked for them. That generalized into track record of all people who work for them, men and women, but it began with looking at women, so it began to develop coaching skills, if you will, for the supervisors. There is some question for a male supervisor, why am I going to be evaluated on what women do after they work with me? And I may not be responsible for them. I look at the raw material, I look at the challenging context. Why should I be held accountable for that? And so the question was, are there any male supervisors just like you who all of a sudden have found ways to help their female proteges or their female subordinates advance? And the answer is yes. And that led then to an inquiry about what did those men do that women reported as being useful for them in mentoring behavior. Once there was a discovery that perhaps I, as a less experienced or less sophisticated male boss, could improve the level of my game in helping my female subordinates advance and solve problems in this culture, then the resistance that I initially experienced began to dissipate. This was 10 years ago. I should say as a caveat that I am not current in my knowledge of what's going on there, but I have heard just last month that not only does this effort continue, but it has a broad graduate network, and it has connected women and men to help each other navigate some of the business changes for J&J in Europe, and has been seen as not only making J&J more resilient, but making J&J more nimble and more facile in dealing with changing business environments.